Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zobrio University webinar on Financial Edge Fraud Prevention Techniques, Financial System Controls. Today we have Chuck Hayes, our Director of Application Services here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we will go over the questions at the end. I'll now hand it over to Chuck.
Thank you, Colleen. And again, my name is Chuck with Zobrio, and I do manage our consultants for our various product lines. So I'm glad that you're with us today. And so let me tell you a little bit about how this came about. So one of our CPA partner firms, Gregory Shin, he's with Thurman Shin and Company in Farmington, I believe. We have had ongoing conversations with Greg and jointly with some of our customers about this whole issue about fraud prevention. And that's a common thing for an auditor or CPA. Our customers, for example, and I've participated, years ago, I've been involved in those things myself where I've been part of the presentation. So we thought it might be a good idea just to kind of talk about not only the issues around the system itself, but just the internal controls that you have in place, because as I'm sure you're all aware, the 90% of it really is about the actual physical controls, if you will, that happen at the organization. So let's kind of divide our conversation into two pieces here. Let's talk first about what I like. This is my personal preference for language. I like to refer to these as fraud temptations. So we want to obviously avoid fraud. And I like to kind of frame it in terms of, well, how can we get rid of the temptation? Meaning what we're really saying is it just won't be possible to do it. One of the things that will come up from a system standpoint is just general access, and we'll talk about some of the system considerations in a little bit. But first of all, let's just kind of talk about some issues around these four topics: cash management, purchasing, expense reimbursement, and financial statements. Let's start with cash management. I think that, and this again, Greg and other auditors and CPAs would recommend that you need to think very carefully about what is happening with handling cash. Because one of the fraud temptations would be not reporting cash that I took in. So I'm sitting there, I'm handling cash, and oh, whoops, $20 disappeared, and no one's watching over my shoulder. So it begs the question, who is actually handling cash? And is anyone monitoring that when it's actually, physically happening? Is there a logging process? Are there some ways to verify independently that, yes, cash did come in? So that whole issue around cash processing, logging, who enters the information, who does the review, how can you make sure that actual cash wasn't somehow disappeared through the process? So that's a key component for what we'll talk about next from the system standpoint is our Zobrio cash management system, because there are some security considerations there, but that assumes that you've already put some controls in place to make sure that someone's not, just making the cash go away and never actually working its way through the system. But once we get into the data entry piece, then Zobrio Cash Management can take over as well. We'll take a look at a couple of screenshots for that. So we'll kind of do all of them together. From a purchasing standpoint, one of the common scenarios, and I used to, when I was working with customers, I would have this conversation as part of the security reviews in the system, but I broadened it to what I'm about to say now. So we have two different versions of this. One is, okay, I put in a new vendor and I put in the invoice, but I changed the address where the payment will go because I'm planning on taking that money and you'll never hear from me again. And so then everything goes through the process. No one bothers to notice that the address was changed. And the check gets mailed, because I don't mail out the check that somebody else does. Next thing you know, that shows up in my possession and I cash it, and then I'm gone before you can catch up with me. Now I realize, there may be some, you could eventually go after me in some way, shape, or form, but the point is it should not be allowed to happen. So that's one example, but then you also have the issue of, well, is this a real vendor and is this a real invoice? So I think that, whatever paper controls you have in place, or, obviously invoices come over email, but what are your controls around entering new vendors? And, is one person kind of doing everything and no one's really reviewing that and cross-referencing that information with other pieces of information? How do you make sure that the address wasn't updated and therefore misdirecting a payment. What do you do to verify that, if it's an invoice for goods and services, were the services performed? Did the goods actually arrive? So those kinds of internal controls around what I'll loosely refer to as the paper flow in the organization, those can be really key to how you monitor what's happening. And I know when I was director of IT for a foundation where we were using the financial aid, we had a lot of discussions around this. And I'm going to show you some examples of screenshots where it's like, yeah, here are the security settings, and we can kind of keep things kind of at arm's length through the whole process and do the separation of duties. So that's, another possible list of examples. And then when we get to expense reimbursement, now sometimes this ties to invoicing, but for the financial edge, there is a separate module that is now referred to as expense management. It was previously referred to as web invoicing. And that's where what essentially employees can do expense reimbursement requests, just like they're basically filling out an expense report online. And they may be doing credit card charges, and they might have invoices that are being attached to. Maybe you authorize them to purchase, small amounts of supplies that they then bring into the office or something like that. So that also gets into the whole issue of, well, are they disguising charges? They just do a receipt that's kind of a summary and it looks kind of reasonable. What was really behind it? Do you require the detail? What's your threshold for providing receipts? And, to what extent could that become a problem? So that whole receipting review process, especially for credit card charges, if they're part of expense reimbursement, it's just another example of another twist on the whole issue around just controls that you would have in place internally. And then finally, and this is my big one, financial statements. So this isn't so much a system security. The other three have very specific options in the system for how you can separate duties. With financial statements, my big suggestion, I'll put it this way, is that really you need to think carefully about issuing reports in Microsoft Excel or using it to print out financial statements. So my preference or my recommendation, and then I did this when I was director of IT at the foundation that I was at, is that if you're going to publish something using Excel, even if it ends up in printed form, if you're going to publish it using Excel, there's obviously the possibility that someone changed a number. So how do you get around that? Well, in my opinion, everything that is published in Excel should have behind it a report that is being generated by Financial Edge directly out of the system to PDF, and with including the page that shows what the settings were, so that you have backup, so that no matter what anyone questions, including at a board meeting or an internal meeting or the auditor, if you're publishing from Excel, then you can say, oh no, that top line number there for revenue or for this grant or for this project or whatever it was, here's the report that goes with it. Notice it's the same date, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want, you can go in and run that same report now in the system if you like, and you can pull the same information. So the idea would be that it's certainly fine to use Excel to perhaps rearrange information to make it easier to view or present or consolidate, but there should always be financial reports coming directly out of Financial Edge that help back that up. So let's just take a few minutes and talk about some of the system settings that can especially help you with those first three examples around cash management and then also around the Financial Edge security. There we go. So when it comes to our Zobrio cash management system, and by the way, we're going to be rebranding it as VAI Banking, so that'll be coming soon. But Zobrio cash management has two levels of security that are especially helpful for the discussion we just had. So when it comes to what are loosely referred to as roles, you can set up in ZCM, okay, this user is allowed these specific access privileges. And our ZCM help desk can provide you with the documentation behind, the specifics for each of the listed roles, but they all have specific access options. So an accountant can enter the following things, and an auditor could do these things. And it's all been carefully worked out based on customer feedback, but that's one of the simplest ways in Zobrio Cash Management to make sure that Jill or John or whoever it is able to access what they need for their role, but nothing more. And then you can separate out the duties accordingly. And then another, I talked earlier about handling cash, or just what we loosely refer to as receipts. So it may be checks or not just cash, but when those come in, you can also restrict in the slower screenshot who has access to which receipts. So let's say I'm working in an office that just handles tax payments. I don't really get involved in utility bills or something else, or something like that. Then you can, in this list on the lower right where it says change user assignments, there'll be a long list there of all your different receipts and the names you've given them. And you can check off for the highlighted person on the left, what's Aaron allowed to work with? And that way I can't make up something, or mess with something or change something that is completely outside of what I would normally be involved with. So those are a couple key examples from Zobrio Cash Management that can really help from a data entry standpoint. And then assuming that all the other controls are in place, then you also have the ability with these different roles to review other people's work, or even, allow it to continue through the process. So that can be really key to the whole process with cash management in general. And then in the Financial Edge, there are two general ways that establish security within Financial Edge. So there's what's referred to as security, which really is about users and groups, which I'll mention in a moment. But the other piece, which generally shows up in business rules, is just as robust, and that can also help with a general separation of duties. So let me just talk in general first about the users and groups. So in Financial Edge, obviously to log in you need a user ID, but the privileges are really established at the group level. And basically you decide what you want. And yeah, I can be in many groups depending on what I do. So maybe I do data entry for AP invoices. Maybe I do journal entries at the end of the month in general ledger. So I could be in two different groups that only allow me to do the things I just said, but then there can be other groups for AP that perhaps allow greater access, or other groups for general ledger that also allow greater access. So you kind of plan out, okay, what is it this person needs to do? And the thing to think about, I think the best way to frame it as, if you can open it or access it in Financial Edge, there's a security option around it. And I can restrict what you can do. And the biggest one centers around the records that you open. So I open up an invoice or open up a vendor record. And for those, you have view, add, edit, delete privileges, which is typical for most financial systems. And then within those privileges, with Financial Edge, it kind of follows the tabs, but specific pieces of information can be restricted. So let's go back to my example of altering the address of an invoice. So I intentionally included a screenshot here of vendor privileges. And you'll see on this image on the left, there's a list of vendor information, and this is basically the tabs. One of them is the addresses tab, and you'll see there's a column for view, add, and edit. So all I'd have to do is uncheck add and edit, and Chuck can only view the vendor address, but Chuck can't actually alter the vendor address. And that means all addresses, and certainly the address that would be used for payment. So that's just one example, but again, pretty much if you can see it, we can somehow restrict it. And then I also showed in the screenshot at the bottom, you'll see the checkbox, enter 1099 adjustments. And I bring that up to mention, when you get into some of the very specific areas like banks or even the vendor records, there are potentially buttons or individual options that make sense from an additional security control. And that goes to things like, well, I might be able to print a check, but I can't add a bank. And I can't, I can't reprint checks. Or maybe that I can enter invoices, but I can't post the invoices. So those kinds of process decisions also have security options. And then on the right-hand side, this is where I was trying to go after this idea of processing in general, not so much can Chuck post or not. But there is what is loosely referred to as approval rules in Financial Edge, and it's primarily around accounts payable invoices and general ledger journal entry batches. And what we're really talking about is a status field. So in an invoice, there's a status field, and in a batch for general ledger, there's a status field. And the status field might have a couple different choices, but at some point there's a status of approved. So what these rules that I pictured here basically do is they require that the status end up being approved, even if it starts as pending or something like that. Well, then security comes into play. So Chuck, perhaps, is not allowed to use the approval status, and that would be a security feature on the left. So I can't change the status to approved. All I ever see is pending. So I put in an invoice or whatever, it's got a status of pending, then someone else has to go in and change the status to approved. And there's some group ways to do that. And then the invoice is allowed to continue the process. The same thing for the journal entry batch. I can put in the entry and I can say, hey, I'm ready to go, but you need to change the status to approved. Then the person B changes the status to approved. Now I could then be allowed to post, but keep in mind that this business rule says, well, it can't be posted until it's approved. Well, if Chuck can't set the setting to approve, then I can't post it either until someone else has reviewed it. So again, just to summarize, there are security settings around specific choices, but then we do have a loosely defined approval rule process for AP invoices and for general ledger batches. And then in expense management, that particular module, there are what are referred to as approval rules. And so you kind of route it through to different users that they do all the review, and they can then verify the receipts and do all the things that I talked about earlier. So that's pretty much how it works. So again, just to summarize, we strongly encourage you to look at each of the potential gaps that could lead in your internal procedures that could lead someone to be tempted to be fraudulent with, some sort of activity, whether it's the way they do reports or information that they're, withholding or they're redirecting or things like that. And then there are also security settings that you really want to think about. And the last comment I'll make is a lot of folks, they just kind of leave FE set up that everybody has supervisor rights, which is a huge no-no, because that means I can do anything and no one can stop me and, I can do anything I want in the system. And so even if someone needs to have a high level of privileges, you still want to use the group process to specify what those are. And then if your auditor starts asking about system settings, we can run a report that says, well, here's what everybody's security is. And then if you have some good settings in place, then I don't think that the auditor will be at all upset with the fact that, we really have done separation of duties here. So like always, we're here to help. And if you just have some basic questions about, oh, by the way, could you show me where those groups are or whatever, you're welcome to call our help desk. But if you want, for instance, a lot of our customers will ask us to do a security review, and then we'll kind of methodically walk through what are your internal procedures, what are the settings you need, and then we'll go through everybody's roles and then make sure that all of the pieces are in place. And we'd be glad to give you a quote for that so that we can help you make sure that that's all good. And then that also would involve making sure you have the reports that you can show the auditors about how you're handling things. So thank you very much, and I'll just wait a few minutes to see if we have any questions, but we really appreciate your attendance.
Thank you everyone for joining us. A recording of this webinar will be made available shortly.